Where are you guys at today?
We're in Northern California, Humboldt County, about 5 hours north of Oakland.
Hmm.
See if this is working.
Yeah, you're up.
We're good?
Mhm.
All right. Welcome, all of you that are out here on this sunny day in Northern California. I'm excited to continue our virtual Indigenous speaking series with our guest today, Julian Brave Noisecat. I also have my colleague Shoshone Hostler here on the set. A little bit about Julian is that he's well-rounded. He's a journalist, activist, and policy analyst. He's the director of the Green New Deal strategy at Data for Progress. And you can find his work all over. He's been published in The Guardian, The Nation, Huffington Post, Esquire, and he studied history at Columbia University and then went on to Oxford University for his graduate degree. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks so much for having me, Virgil.
And welcome,
And Shoshone, of course.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. I'm a mental health therapist for Two Feathers, Native American Family Services.
Thank you, Shoshone. And before I ask Julian our first question, I just wanted to pay honor to the land that we are on, which is Wiyot land in McKinleyville. And I also want to let everybody know that I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria. I'm Yurok and Talawa. And I want to let the audience know that we are here at Two Feathers standing in solidarity with all those that are continuing to struggle and fight for justice. And so with that, Julian, our first question for you is really just to get to know you a little bit more, get our audience to know you a little bit more. And one of the things in our research of you that, you said that one of the things that inspires your work is the belief that Indigenous people can contribute to understanding and solving the world's pressing challenges. And so I would like to invite you to talk a little bit about, in these times, with the pandemic, with the killing of yet another Black man, what are your thoughts about these issues, as well as what our people, Indigenous people, can offer?
So that's a really big question. So I'll do my best to answer it. But first, I just want to say thanks again for having me on. I'll introduce myself in my language real quick, just because I like to do that especially when I'm talking to Native or primarily Native audiences. So wait, up Julian Brave Noisecat when squext, when Kika Hedesquest, when Alexander Radief, when Kekachedesquest, when Edarchi Noisecat, Sequachmok and a Statland and it's Eskin Wichtakwen, the Oakland Wichtakwen, Letwan Poopsman, Elitic to me, with Piscataway Uluch. Hello, everyone. Is what I said. I said that my mother, her name is Alexandra Roddy, and my father's name is Ed Archie Noisecat. I come from the Secwepemc and Statlian Nations in what is now British Columbia, Canada. My family primarily resides on the Canham Lake Reserve in British Columbia, but I grew up actually in Oakland, California. So it's good to be speaking with some Northern California natives. And I'm calling you guys from Washington, D.C., which is the territory of the Piscataway people. And last night in D.C., sometimes referred to as Chocolate City, there was a big protest, as there has been across the United States in the last few days, in front of the White House, actually here in front of the White House. So at the end of my work day, which work is obviously like for most people, I'm working from home. I'm sitting at my kitchen table right now, actually. So I walked down to 16th Street, and sort of where Lafayette Park would be, except they had it all blocked off with fences, and there was like National Guard vehicles, and there was a sort of big crowd of protesters who had gathered there. Here in DC, there's a 7 p.m. curfew. There has been in the last couple nights. And actually yesterday was the DC primary. And what was interesting to me is that even here in the nation's capital, some of the sort of constitutional rights of this country were basically dead letter. So the curfew for 7 p.m. was imposed to prevent people from going out in the streets and protesting late into the night. So it was, in a certain sense, in my view, a violation of our First Amendment rights to free speech and protest. Purposefully, the cops were there to try to prevent us from being able to voice our outrage at the murder of George Floyd and the murder of Black people by police officers across the country, something that's been happening for far too long and needs to stop. And also it was the primary election day here in Washington, D.C. And because of the pandemic, a lot of the polling places actually were closed. And some of my friends had to stand in line for 5 or 6 hours just to vote. So I think it's pretty notable and kind of a good encapsulation of the darkness of this moment that we're in with the pandemic, with the police killings of Black people and also of other people, of course. And, you know, the difficulty that people face in even just being able to vote in our democratic system, sort of really encapsulated to me how broken a lot of these circumstances and systems are that we've inherited. And that led me to think about, you know, what led me to sort of the work that I do, which I would say is kind of like justice adjacent work. I don't think that we actually get to see justice a lot in the real world, but a lot of the work that I do, whether it's sort of journalism or policy analysis and advocacy or activism and organizing, is sort of intended to use these different tools that we have at our disposal, whether that be writing and the media or organizing people or using art and activism, using the tools of government and policy to try to get more just outcomes in the world. What really led me to that is sort of two things, I would say. I'd say the first is growing up in a place like Oakland, where so many social movements were born and where that history was very alive in the community that I grew up in, whether we're talking about the United Farm Workers, whether we're talking about the Black Panthers, or whether we're talking about the Indians of all tribes who occupied Alcatraz Island, you know, the site of the former federal prison, in a protest that in many ways sort of launched actually the current era of Native American activism and rights and self-determination that we're still sort of living in right now. And so that was a big part of what drove me, you know, to do this work and to be there yesterday in front of the White House with so many other people. And then the other part of it is also, I think, just understanding, as I'm sure tons of people who are watching and as our people know across the United States and beyond, that, you know, as Native people, we suffered and lived through one of the greatest injustices that has happened in this world. We lost an entire continent, 2 continents worth of land. You know, entire villages and entire communities and nations were decimated in what I think is finally being acknowledged that was a genocide. You know, our children were taken away to boarding schools in the United States and residential schools in Canada. As a result, many of our languages and cultures are on the brink of being lost, on the brink of oblivion. And still to this day, we live with the disproportionate burden of policing, the disproportionate burden of pipelines and extractive industries in our traditional territories, industries that create public health problems with dirty air and dirty water, higher rates of cancer from uranium mining and other sort of toxic, hazardous, modes of production. And then also, of course, with the phenomenon, really, really grisly phenomenon of our women in particular, but also our queer and two-spirit relatives going missing and murdered, right? These are all realities that we live with that are in many ways just an extension of the colonization of our people and our land. And I was, fortunate enough to grow up in a household and in a community in Oakland where we were aware of that and we talked about that. And we grappled with that history. And I think that also, from Alcatraz onwards, we really thought about what it would mean to change those circumstances, what it would look like for our people to have justice, to have power, to have sovereignty. And so, that is really what brought me to this work. That's what led me to want to pursue things like writing and media. That's what led me to be interested in things like policy, which I think is one means to try to change these circumstances using the tools that we have in government. That's what led me to caring about things like activism and organizing, the ability to bring people together and then sort of direct them through a campaign, to sort of change a law or to win an election or, to push for a reform or a symbolic change or things like that. And, I think that the reason why I really highlight that piece of Indigenous peoples having something to contribute to that broader fight is that, very often we are discounted. We're not even talked about or imagined as being people who are still here, let alone being people who are leading a fight for progress and justice. There's a very celebrated historian named Jill Lepore, whose writing I actually personally love, who wrote a book, A History of the United States, that came out last year, and it was celebrated and won all sorts of awards. And it only mentions Native Americans in the 20th century a single time, and that is during the occupation of Alcatraz. She mentions us in a single sentence as participating in this occupation of the former federal prison. And she actually, ironically, as a historian, didn't even bother to get the correct organization leading the occupation right. She said that it was the American Indian movement, and everyone in my community growing up who was part of that occupation made sure that you knew that it was the Indians of all tribes that started the occupation of Alcatraz, and that AIM came in later. So that's all to say that still to this day, people imagine us as being dead and gone, or if they do think about us at all, they think that we live on far off marginal reservations. And that, we are definitely a long ways away from any sort of position of influence or power, and that, they don't really think of us as drivers of activism and progress and all those sorts of things. And I just don't believe that. At the end of the day, I believe that there's a very strong, passionate drive for justice that comes out of our communities and our experience and our worldview. And that we do actually have something distinct to offer to that broader fight, particularly in a moment where we face so many existential crises, whether that be in the form of disease or the rise of authoritarianism, which of course we experienced authoritarianism on our reservations and on our homelands, or through the threat of climate change.
Thank you for that. And as I hear you talk, one of the things that comes up for me is telling the story that's not told. That as being trained in history, and just thinking of the Howard Zinn, the people's history, and I feel like and I'm just going to throw it out there, is part of your work is telling those stories that aren't often told. and telling them in a way that people will pay attention and will listen to, so maybe that we can change the national narratives. Would that be fair to say as a sort of broad conceptualization of your work and what you're trying to do?
To a certain extent. I mean, I think the question is like stories that haven't been told to whom and who hasn't heard those stories, right? I often think about my work as a journalist and storyteller, someone who goes out into communities and, you know, interviews people and then reports on things for magazines or newspapers or podcasts or things like that. Not so much as someone who is, you know, telling a story that hasn't been told before, because the story's already there in our communities. They're already there with our people. You know, they're already often stories that we know about, whether they're stories that we have personally experienced or ones that we know of in our family. I just think that my job is often to sort of collect those stories, to turn them into like a written piece or something like that, to do my job well as a writer and reporter. And then to sort of provide that a platform in a place where it hasn't been seen before, where it hasn't been really grappled with in a significant way. And the truth is that, you know, Native people have very minimal, if any, representation in the media and the culture of the United States in a broader sense, right? We only had our first 2 Native American women elected into Congress just less than 2 years ago. There are 0 anchors or major reporters on any of the cable news networks who are, you know, Native American. The New York Times just put out their sort of diversity statistics, and they claimed that there might be like 1 person in their entire newsroom who has any sort of Native ancestry. And this is like the paper of record in not just the United States, but the world. And of course, you know, it would be really hard to find a film other than like maybe Smoke Signals and The Fast Runner and stuff like that, where the leading role or anyone of any prominence was given to a Native actor. And, you know, I think a lot of sort of non-Native people might think like, well, that's just because there's just not that many Native people in the world. But the truth is actually that there are almost as many Native Americans in the United States as there are Jewish people. So my mother's actually Jewish, and you know, there is not a shortage of Jewish people who are working in journalism, who are working in Hollywood, and who are, you know, playing significant roles in Hollywood and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's not just simply a numbers issue. It's not that there aren't that many Native people. It's that we're not seen, and our stories aren't valued in the places that sort of collect and tell the stories of this country. And that's because I think, you know, the United States is still, has still told itself a story that we're dead and gone, right? That our stories are all ones that, you know, are set in the 1800s, that probably involve a cowboy or John Wayne or someone shooting at us. And that after that story was over, you know, we sort of disappeared into, you know, Monument Valley or whatever. And, you know, there's just not really a sense that there's a place and a narrative for us in contemporary America. And I think that, you know, I don't think I'm so much sort of telling stories that aren't told as, you know, telling the stories that are there and then trying to put them into a place where people haven't listened to or paid attention to them before. And I don't think I'm absolutely not the only one either, right? Like, you know, Tommy Orange wrote an award-winning book just a couple of years ago that told the story of Native people in the city that I grew up in Oakland, right? And that was a story that we all knew was there, but he put it into a novel and opened up that experience and that world to a bunch of readers who had never even considered the fact that there were, Indians living in cities, and that we had our own communities there, and that there was a really vibrant sort of experience that was worth sort of exploring in a novel like that. And I think similarly, things like the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock really put sort of Native people at the forefront of these broader stories and questions over issues like climate change, like pollution, like the fossil fuel economy and the problems that it creates in our communities and all that sort of stuff. And what feels really exciting about that is that, you know, journalists are always kind of looking for the story that hasn't been told. And what I think is really incredible about our community, about the Native community, is that there are so many stories that have not been given that platform, that have not been explored in that kind of way, and that have so much depth of struggle and beauty and detail that I think make for just inherently in what they're made of. You know, the fact that we are people who survived the genocide and went on to, you know, tell stories about, you know, a powwow in Oakland that becomes the site of like a heist, which is the whole premise of There, right? Like the fact that we are those people, like that's cool and that's like dope, and like people should be paying attention to that. And I feel like sometimes my role is simply just like telling them like, hey, this stuff is happening and like it's really cool and like you should be paying attention to it because it matters. So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And as a follow-up before I throw it over to Shoshone, I wonder, in your experience, you know, we've had both Tommy and Tommy Orange and Dallas Goldtooth on here, and you know, he talked about the importance of that he's a communicator and to tell stories. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, is there certain stories or certain themes that you found are ways to present it that have more of an impact? Like, what is it about, let's say, you know, Tommy Orange's awesome novel or the Dakota Pipeline? What was it that captured in your understanding people's attention and then their motivation to make change?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So since you brought up my friend Dallas also, I'll just sort of build on that, because I think that, you know, I think Dallas has a really fascinating story. Like the way that I think his story would be told in a way that is unique and new and interesting is that, like, this Native guy who really is like a comedian, like that's what he really wants to do, is he wants to do the 1491s. And like, you know, I remember before he was like Facebook famous or whatever, and when he was a student at UC Berkeley, like he would show up at the Intertribal Friendship House, and he was like this really goofy guy who was always just making people around him laugh and have a great time. Like that's the guy, the same guy who tells like all the funny jokes and makes all these silly movies where he's like running around in a loincloth and shit. Like that's the guy who also helped turn Standing Rock into like one of the most iconic protests in United States history. Like same dude, you know? And I think that in and of itself is like a really, like, what an interesting guy, what an interesting story, you know? And I think that because Americans have killed Native people in their imaginations and in real life so many times, they have flattened our characters so often in the movies and different sort of places where they even ever bother to tell our story. And they don't bother to grapple with like that depth of texture in someone's character. Like it would be impossible to pitch a movie to Hollywood that was about Native American comedian who led the protest who helped lead the protest at Standing Rock, right? Who helped turn that into like a national moment of reckoning. But that's like a real story that like literally just happened a few years ago, right? So I think that like sort of finding and understanding stories that have that kind of complexity, that have characters that are compelling, that are grappling with, you know, competing interests, that are funny, that, you know, are us, basically, is part of what my job is sometimes as a journalist. It's to like go out and find those stories and to tell people's stories in a way that presents them as full humans on the page, as full, interesting, complex characters with, you know, real meaningful thoughts and real meaningful emotions, and you know, who are trying to sort through some really heavy shit that we've inherited, you know. And then I think the way in which I've been most, the sort of line of thinking that I've been following most recently with my writing and reporting and thinking has been focused on like, okay, what is that inheritance that we have as Native people? What is it that we survived and went through? And how does that matter to people who aren't just us? Because often I have to think about when I'm writing and stuff, like I'm not just writing obviously for Native readers, I'm writing for all sorts of readers. And for me right now, I keep going back to this notion that was actually best articulated to me by this filmmaker, this Blackfoot filmmaker named Cowboy Smith X. Like a couple years ago, Cowboy and I went to a literature festival in France, and he told a room full of Frenchmen that Indigenous people are a post-apocalyptic people. And as soon as he said it, I was like, oh my God, like that's exactly right. I knew exactly what he meant, but I'd never heard someone say it exactly right like that. And what he meant by that is that, you know, colonization, the experience that we have in our recent lived memory, in our family history, in our DNA, actually, if you know, follow the literature around historical trauma, was an apocalypse. We survived some intense stuff where we lost, you know, family, we lost community, we lost land. You know, we lived through some of the darkest chapters of human history, and that happened right here. And it's denied. It's not even known that it took place or even bothered to be studied in a significant way by most of the population. And in a world where now we are facing new apocalypses, in my view, you know, we know that climate change, for example, is going to displace millions, if not billions, of people. It's going to mean that entire parts of the planet are transformed permanently and forever. People are going to be uprooted from coastal cities. There's going to be conflict. There already is conflict. You know, and now where we are living through this pandemic that feels quite apocalyptic in some senses, now that we're living through a moment in history where the rise of authoritarianism and fascism is feeling ever more present for lots of people. And of course, you know, like many of our communities were living under basically dictatorial rule on reservations for a number of decades, where you couldn't leave without the permission of the Indian agent. You know, they took away your children to go to get re-educated at Christian boarding schools and residential schools, where we were abused, like all of that stuff. You know, I think that experience of our people as a post-apocalyptic people, I think it does have something to lend to a broader humanity that is now grappling with its own sort of world-ending crises. And so in sort of a broader philosophical, human, you know, sense, sort of humanities sense, I think that experience and that perspective, which we're still grappling with and living with today, has something to tell to people who aren't just us, and that they should pay attention because of that. So that's the thing that I've been thinking about most often recently. And I think that those two things, both telling sort of the richness of the complexity and of the characters and stories in our communities, and then also explaining why all of that matters, in our sort of current world is sort of the two things that I try to do with my writing and my work. I can't say that I always succeed at it, but that is what I aim for.
Thank you. That makes sense. You know, there was we had a speaker, Howard Fuller. He's an African-American educator, civil rights activist, and he talked about Derek Bell's convergent interests, in the sense of like, you got to get interest to match, or there's not going to be any sort of movement. And so I just thought of that when you were saying that, in the sense of like, you know, what's in it for me? And now that we're in the pandemic, there seems to be a little bit maybe more like, all right, I can understand the Native story. I see how this is similar to the experiences of Indigenous people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of our maybe sort of failings as a species is that we're usually only good at showing compassion and empathy to people or things that we can identify with, which, you know, when we can only identify with a very limited set of experiences that are maybe racially or in terms of gender or in terms of geographic origin or nationality or whatever, or economic circumstance, you know, similar to our own, that becomes a really limiting factor in our ability to love and care for other people. I think that's a problem. But, you know, if there are ways in which we can expand the sort of community that we feel, you know, if we can encourage people to see parts of their own story as being similar to our story, you know, see their own sort of struggle or see their own circumstances as being codependent or synergistic with our own, I think that's where we can unlock people's potential to care and to find common cause with us. And I think that, you know, very recently, some very smart Native organizers and politicians have been really good at figuring out where those intersections are, the ones that Derek Bell was speaking to. And I think that Standing Rock was an incredibly powerful example of that, right? At the end of the day, who's going to say that, you know, water that sustains life is not something worth protecting and fighting for? Like, everybody can align with that. Everybody can, at the end of the day, understand that there is common cause in the fight for, you know, a livable planet and environment, something that we can pass on to our children and their children and the children after them. And I think that, you know, given that we're a community that only comprises about 1 or 2% of the population, you know, our ability to advance our cause and our interests and to empower our tribes and our communities often runs through having to figure out ways to pitch our interests and our causes in a way that, you know, brings in other people, because we can't do it alone, because there's just not enough of us in this country right now. And I think that that's actually a very empowering thing, because it means that we are inherently, you know, coalition builders. And at the end of the day, politics, I think a compassionate politics in particular, more egalitarian politics, is a game of addition. It's always about adding people, bringing in more people. And I think that, you know, some of the brightest Native organizers and people who I've had the chance to get to know and interview and be friends with understand that in a very deep way.
Thank you. And so, Shoshone, I know you've done some some thoughtful research on our guest today, and I just want to throw it over to you to ask the question or make a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Virgil. Yeah, Julian, I read that article that you wrote about Smith X, or included Smith X, and I thought that was really interesting. And the idea of like them flattening our character and how complex our stories are and our histories are, I think that that led me to want to work in mental health in these communities and in my community, because I get to hear and I get to share space with people on a very intimate level, hearing their story and understanding that difficulty, and then where else do they want to go. So I just recently graduated from my master's in counseling psychology courses. And I thought it was really interesting when you're talking about current history books being written and how little discourse there is in Native American inclusion in that. I found this similar things with even in a multicultural psychology, where the topic is to talk about different cultures and peoples, and how limiting that even was. And I thought it was really interesting, a quote that you had in one of your articles. I wrote it down. You said, enduring psychology of racial entitlement. And I thought that was really profound, because I feel like if words and those issues were really included in these books, that people might have a greater insight about what that actually means. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that topic right now.
So the topic is I just got a little feedback from everything.
Oh, sorry. It's enduring psychology of like racial entitlement, like what you meant by that.
Yeah, I mean, so my mom's white, so I think I'm allowed to bash white people a little bit. So I think that there is very clearly a history and ongoing reality in this country of white people being entitled, particularly white men, but white people more generally speaking, being entitled to pretty much the entire pie, and then everyone else was fighting over little tiny slivers. And slowly over time, as we got the right to vote, as we got civil rights, as the sovereignty and right to self-determine of our tribes was finally formally acknowledged, in a way that sort of has slowly started to catch up with the original intent of the treaties, which were between nations. I think that we've slowly tried and started to level the playing field, but we're still a long, long way from getting there. All but one of our presidents were white guys. In a country that is not entirely white. So, and of course that's like an incredibly, I'd be remiss not to say that that's not an incredibly live issue and question right now, as we talk about the ways that the police relate to Black people in particular, and communities of color more broadly speaking, versus the way that they relate to white people. Like the presence of police in places like Oakland looks a lot different if you're in East or West Oakland than it does if you're in the hills, right? And the way that the police relate to those different communities is incredibly different, and that has been sort of like normalized in this country. The notion that it would be, that a certain subset of the population would have, one set of rules, one set of relationships with law enforcement, one set of relationships with our constitutional rights, one set of relationships with our democracy, and everyone else would have a much different relationship is still normal, is still the norm. I work in politics at least part of the time. And one of the fascinating ways that this shows up in people who work in like sort of electoral and party politics is that basically, because people of color are so reliable to show up and vote for, or mostly show up for Democrats, they're actually not even paid attention to by the people who do like electioneering, who do like, you know, the strategy around which votes we're going to try to pursue and persuade every 2-4 years, right? Like, because, you know, Democrats sort of take the voters of color for granted because the other guys are basically racist. You know, that means that they prioritize so much of their marketing, so much of where they put organizers on the ground to go knock on people's doors, so much of the resources into where they send mailers, in sort of like white suburban communities and like communities where people vote Democrat one year and vote Republican the next year. And those communities overwhelmingly tend to be white. So basically, what I'm saying is that even in our democracy, like, not all votes are pursued as you know, aggressively by the party that is the party of diversity, which is the Democratic Party. You know, some votes there's more attention paid to them because white people are fickle, and, you know, in 2012 decided they're voting for Barack Obama, but in 2016 they decided that they're going to vote for Donald Trump, who says that he wants to round up Mexicans and send them to another country, who says he wants to ban Muslims from coming into our country. And so basically, like, just the way that that sort of entitlement and prioritization of white people shows up in all sorts of parts of our life, and particularly, I would say, in our political system, but also just, you know, in our economy, everywhere else, is really intense and has become so normal that, like, when you protest racism, people say that you're protesting the United States of America, right? Like, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem, everyone was like, you're not being patriotic, as though, you know, protesting the brutalization of Black people and people of color was somehow anti-American, because racism itself has become, for a large portion of the country, such a normalized hierarchy, such a normalized thing.
Thank you. I had a follow-up. You know, I text actually Tommy Orange this morning to ask a little bit about you to prepare, and one of the things that he said that I should ask is your experiences at Oxford, and I know that and also your book that you're working on. But one of the things in an article with the correspondent, it said, at 26, Julian Brave Noisecat has already grappled with a range of human experiences wider than many people will know in a lifetime. And then, you know, you had the experience of both getting into a scholarship to go to Oxford, as well as, you know, bailing your father out of jail. And so I'm wondering, like, if you could speak to like what has shaped you in those experiences at Oxford and in growing up in Oakland, and because you come off as incredibly intelligent and confident. And so for those natives that may be watching, such as Shoshone and myself, I'm just curious about, you know, how you've become who you've become, which is a very, very talented, as well as up and coming, but already not up and coming, just an established person that people listen to.
Well, firstly, thank you. That was, I think, a little too kind of an estimation of what I do. And to be completely honest about the book thing, I'm supposed to have a call with my agent on Friday, but I'm going to tell her on that call that I have not made any headway since the last time we talked. So I'm barely treading water sometimes, is how I feel. You know, yeah. So I did get the. It was a complicated story, and it was quite the opportunity. But I did get the opportunity to go to the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, and I got a scholarship to do that. Even that story is one that I think is complicated by sort of my race and background. The experience I had there, and I wrote about it, was actually one of the first things that I ever published that wasn't for like the school newspaper or something, was that I was a finalist for the Rhodes Scholarship, which is like a really prestigious scholarship that sends 38 Americans to Oxford every year. And in my interview, a woman who was a senior executive at Google told me, firstly, that she liked to go heli skiing, which is like a very fancy thing that rich people do, where they get in a helicopter and then they fly to the top of a mountain and they ski down it, in a place that's very close to where my family comes from, and my family does not heli ski. So she said that in our interview, which really threw me off. And then she also asked me what I felt to be at the time a very biased and sort of dog whistle-y kind of question about why Native people didn't have to pay taxes, and why I needed to justify that. And she asked me that in front of like the whole entire people, the entire panel. And it completely threw me off. And suffice it to say, I did not get this prestigious scholarship that I really wanted. I did end up getting another scholarship, which is a more academic scholarship. And actually for a little while, I thought that I was gonna become, I'm a big history nerd, so I thought I was gonna become a historian. And then actually my experience at Oxford, which was a pretty mixed bag, suggested to me that I didn't actually want to study history, and that maybe I wanted to do things that were more aligned with current issues and events. But yeah, looking back, you know, even the sort of challenge of going to the UK, feeling like really out of place, feeling really isolated at the place where I was studying to get a master's, feeling like I did not belong, feeling like I didn't deserve to be there, you know, having all of that self-doubt and, you know, self-medicating to get through all of that experience. You know, I think even that in retrospect, I think is an experience that I wouldn't do over in a different kind of way. I think that, you know, ultimately, even some of the sort of hardest things that I've had to live through, like dealing with, like, you know, issues with my father and stuff like that, I think are things that, you know, make us into who we are in a fully rounded, you know, human sense. Like, it's both the beauty and the tragedy of our lives that make us into who we are. And as Native people, of course, we have lived with more than our fair share of hardship and tragedy in our own lives, in our parents' lives, in their parents' lives, and going back and back and back. And I think that in a certain way, from a certain perspective, if we don't allow that to break us, if we don't get consumed by that, which is a real challenge, that in itself can make us stronger, I think. I think that those experiences actually, in a fuller sense of time, can make us who we are and make us into people who are alive to more parts of the human experience and can relate to more parts of the human experience, and you know, can prepare us better for, you know, lives that are, you know, broader in their compassion and deeper in their love and all of that sort of stuff. And that's my sort of relationship to that history, what you mentioned around, you know, both having bailed out my own dad from jail and going to a very prestigious university. And I think that's the perspective that I try to hold on it. But, you know, I would be lying if it's not hard sometimes, you know, to, you know, hear news about, you know, what's going on with your family or loved ones, and to have to deal with that in a way that, you know, a lot of white people don't. That's hard. But if we're able to, you know, hold it together and keep on pushing on, I do think that it makes us into who we are. And my limited experience of like interviewing other people, like Representative Deb Haaland and folks like that who, have real stories of hardship in their own lives and their own histories, but who now have made it into places where they're able to make a real difference in people's lives, is that it's not despite what they went through, that they got to where they are, but it's actually because of what they went through. And so I try to keep that own perspective, and I hope that other people sort of come at their own experience with that kind of perspective as well.
So as a follow-up, and then, one last question from the audience, Julian, I wonder, like, and I'm speaking about my own experience, that throughout my life, I've had to navigate multiple different cultures, right? I grew up on the rancheria with a similar sort of family background. And then, I went to graduate school, ended up doing my postdoc at Stanford, and I had to navigate these different worlds. And so my question to you, and also is about this balance between, like, it's not the right wording, but I'm just going to say it, like code switching and being just generally authentic and real. And Therese Myatt, we had on here too. And one of the things that I took from reading Tommy's book was how, real and authentic, and just like, screw it, I'm going to say this. And one of the things that I think he says is, I'm just being myself. And so I'm wondering, like, where you're at, because you're in politics too. So where you're at with that balance between, this is me, I'm not going to play, different roles, I'm just who I am, versus like, I got to play those different roles. I got to do that sort of code switching.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that my experience growing up was, particularly in Oakland, was that I was constantly moving between different worlds and communities, and that was often quite challenging. So like, ever since I was a little kid, we'd always go back to the res for the holidays, for like Christmas and New Year. And it was always really jarring for me to like go from that world and visiting family and, being surrounded by family, being at my which is our word for grandmother's house, and doing all that. And then going back to, life in Oakland. Like it was very different places. But similarly also in Oakland, like Oakland's a really diverse city, and there's like lots of different communities inside of Oakland. And I was not a super social person, but I was a fairly social person. And like, a lot of my friends growing up were not people who were as like motivated to do well in school as I was. So even within my own like school groups, like friends growing up, like I would have to like kind of code switch between, the kids who were taking the, honors and AP classes or whatever, and then like the kids who were not doing that. And I guess the risk in sort of being someone who moves between so many different worlds is that you kind of get unmoored from who you are and where you come from. And I think that at times I have felt like I've gotten sort of distance from family and community and myself by being in the worlds that I'm in. I'll be completely honest and say that like being in the capital of this country and having to, work with people who work for some of the most powerful politicians in the United States, feels pretty alienating sometimes. And these are not my people at all. But I think being able to come back to the things that you love, the people you love, and who you are, can, in a world where some of us have to do that a lot, have to move between different communities and places and professional settings and all that sort of stuff, who have to code switch, if you will. I think as long as you continue to hold who you are, and then once in a while, go home and touch wood, I think that you can remain grounded and I think we need people who are able to move between those worlds. Like we need people like Deb Haaland who are able to, you know, go up to Capitol Hill and do battle and advocate and try to make sure that when we're passing these stimulus bills, that there are tribal priorities in them, and at the same time can go home to her pueblo and, you know, cook a mean meal for feast day. Like same person, and we need people who are able to do all those things, right?
Thank you. And I see we're at 1:59. Do you have time for one last question?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I'm going to throw it over to Shoshone.
So we have a question from the audience from Jennifer Oliphant. She's one of our clinicians here as well. She asks if you can talk a little bit more about what you're doing in politics right now.
So I work at a small left-wing think tank called Data for Progress. And what we're working on right now is sort of developing the Green New Deal, which was a resolution and platform that was first put forward by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and has subsequently been taken up by a number of progressive politicians in the Democratic Party, including Senator Bernie Sanders. You know, sort of the big picture for that work is that if Democrats win an election in November, which is something that's way beyond my control, and also end up taking back the Senate. You know, we are in the middle of a historic depression. There's over 30 million people who have filed for unemployment. You know, we are also in the middle of a pandemic, and we need to take action on climate change like yesterday. And so there is some interest, I would say, from a broad swath of folks who are sort of in the broader orbit of the Democratic Party, everyone from like youth activists to, you know, folks in high places in leadership who want to make sure that we do something that moves the ball on climate change, maybe something that looks like a Green New Deal. And so that's sort of what my day-to-day work looks like, is that we're working on some of the policy and research, and also some of the sort of political relationship building and like sort of alignment creating, and some media stuff around developing what a Green New Deal might look like. So it's pretty exciting stuff, but it's also feels like it's obvious we're not doing this alone also, but you know, it feels like a pretty big responsibility. And yeah, I'm just really, really anxious for what's going to happen in November, because especially with what's happening this week, it feels really, really high stakes.
Thank you. So that was bring it on home to politics from where we started. I think that was a good last question. And I want to thank you, Julian, for getting on here with us. I can only imagine how busy you are right now in these times. And I want to thank Shoshone, and I want to thank everybody that has tuned in. This video or interview will be put on our YouTube page, Two Feathers /NAFS, and we'll be back at the speaker series, the narrative speaker series tomorrow with local professor Ronnie Schwartz at 12 o'clock. Thank you again and take care.